Virgin Most Powerful Radio, sharing the gospel with clarity and charity.
And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
And welcome, everybody, to Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo. And I am your host and sensei for this hour, Gary Michuta. Welcome aboard, folks. It's great to be with you. You know, I call this the Apologetics Dojo. Why? Because it's a training area. It's a way to keep fit and sharp so that we'll be able and willing to be able to give a defense for the hope that's in us with clarity, charity, and confidence. And, you know, part of that training is it's just like working out with weights. You know, you don't always work on one part of your body. You work on different parts, right? One day you might work on your legs, another way weightlifting, cardio, things like that. You need to mix it up. And that's what I tried to do here on the program is to mix it up. And this week we had a very, very cool lineup of guests. We talked about the Stone Campbell movement with Bruce Sullivan. We had John Mark Grodi talk about the relationship of virtue and truth. John DeRosa, we're talking about theistic apologetics. Yesterday we had Troy Guy on the show talk about how Baptists came to embrace sacramentality. And today we're going to switch things up yet again. And this is we're going to have the guy who started the modern Catholic apologetics movement in the United States. Karl Keating is going to be joining us on the other side of the break, and we're going to be continuing our series with Karl on basically looking at apologetic classics. You know, there's so many great works that have been written by Catholics over the years, even over the centuries, that unfortunately, you know, people forget about it. You may not know about these resources, but they truly deserve to be on every apologist's bookshelf. And so today we're going to look at, with Karl, we're going to be looking at another apologetics classic, and that is written by Father Herbert Thurston and his book on no popery. So very cool program. Can't wait to talk to Karl. I'm familiar with some of Thurston's work, but not this particular work. So I look forward to what Karl has to say about the book. And, of course, he's going to be coming up on the other side of the break. And we also switch things up on Fridays with the Finding the Fallacy. You know, Monday through Thursday we look at informal fallacies, but just bad ways of thinking, I guess, bad arguments. And on Friday we switch things up. We look at a propaganda technique, which is quite different. You know, propaganda is aimed at not so much giving a kind of pseudo-argument, as much as a way to manipulate people's emotions and thought patterns. And today's propaganda technique is the preemptive framing technique, which is used a lot, especially in the area of politics. And also we meet an early church father. Today's early church father is, in my humble opinion, a biggie, especially in the area of apologetics, and that is St. Irenaeus of Lyons. So got great stuff in store for us. Before we kick off, you know, the Finding of Fallacy, I want to welcome and salute all those watching live stream on Facebook and YouTube. Hello, everybody. Great to see familiar names, even a couple of new names out there. Welcome aboard, folks. I also want to welcome all of you listening on radio stations around the United States and also via podcast around the world from our flagship website, which is virginmostpowerfulradio.org, or perhaps you're listening to us through our handy-dandy phone app. If you don't have the phone app, definitely get it, because it is a treasure of lots of freebies. And you know me, I love freebies. And also you can access all the programs, Hands-On Apologetics, and all the other great programs produced by Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And that's very important because many of us are stationed in place because of the virus outbreak. Well, guess what? We can do apologetics in place. through social media. And part of that is, evangelism. And one way to evangelize is just let your friends know, those who love the faith, who want to learn how to defend the faith. Tell them about the program. Send them links. We have a YouTube channel, or of course you could always send it to the website. But if you send them to the YouTube channels, encourage them to subscribe, thumbs up, all the other good stuff in social media, because it does help not only spread the word and get these great guests, get them access to these great guests and subjects, but it also helps out the ministry of Virgin Most Powerful Radio. So we greatly appreciate it. So I want to thank you in advance if you haven't done it, but you're about to, and I want to thank all of you who have. So welcome aboard, everybody. Let's see. If you have a question for Karl, you could always give us a call at 888-526-2151. That's 888-526-2151. Now, of course, with Karl, since he's talking about a particular author and book, let's try to, if you have a question, make sure that it's on the topic of either Herbert Thurstons' work or his book, No Popery, or some suggestions on reading or something like that. All right, so let's jump to the Finding the Fallacy, shall we, which, of course, is a propaganda technique, and that is preemptive framing. Preemptive framing is where somebody frames an issue before others get a chance to do so. Okay, in other words, what you do is you frame a particular position or argument, you define what it is, you define what's important, what's not important, and therefore you kind of control the chessboard. You rearrange the chessboard to be to work in your favor. Now, what's interesting about this propaganda technique is it's actually also a strategy used in negotiations. When a negotiator goes into, negotiating for a contract or something like that, what they'll do is they will try to position themselves and the agenda in order to shine the most favorable light on what otherwise might have been the case. In other words, they want to frame the argument, frame the negotiation in a way that's most favorable to their position and most unfavorable to the opposition's position. So how does this occur? Well, in politics, it's easy. If anything, just pay attention to how bills are named. On what you'll have a bill that has nothing to do with welfare of the family, yet it'll be called the Save the Children's Bill or something like that. That's framing, or preemptive framing. That's couching the bill in a way that is most favorable to people outsiders who may read it, and also takes the focus off the fact that it probably has a whole bunch of pork in it, and things that really have nothing to do with the welfare of children. I think that's the one example that jumps to my mind. You also get this in debates. Often when somebody has an affirmative position that they have to defend, usually the affirmative gets to frame the argument, do this preemptive framing and basically lay out what's important and what's not. And it's up to the opposition to kind of break through that framing. So it's used a lot. So one thing about propaganda techniques, folks, is when you know that it's being used on you, that's when its power disappears. So knowledge is strength in this case. And that's our Finding the Fallacy, or rather our propaganda technique for today, the preemptive framing. Let's jump to our Meet the Early Church Father, who is St. Irenaeus of Lyons, born sometime around 140, died sometime around 202 A.D. St. Irenaeus is the second bishop of Lyons, succeeding the martyred bishop Pontianus in the year 177 or 178 A.D. He himself was perhaps around 37 years old, so he's a younger bishop. He was a native of Asia Minor, and this is really an important fact of his bio. He's a native of Asia Minor, probably of Smyrna, where in his youth he was a pupil of St. Polycarp. His passage to Gaul, where he met him as an esteemed presbyter of the Church of Lyons immediately before his death of the episcopal predecessor, is one of history's mysteries. The exchange figs for frogs is incredible. I have no idea what Jurgens is talking about there. But ultimately, what's important is that Irenaeus represents the faith as known both in the East and the West. He was born in Asia Minor. He knows Gaul, which would be modern-day France, so that would be the West. He also was a disciple of St. Polycarp, who, as you know on this program, is an apostolic father and one who was a disciple of the Apostle John. So he's only one generation removed from the apostles. So you can trace a link from John to Polycarp to Irenaeus of Lyons, which means that his testimony about the beliefs of Christians is very strong and very early. True to his name, Irenaeus was a peacemaker, as Eusebius remarks. It was Irenaeus who sought to make peace between Pope St. Victor of Rome and Polycrates of Ephesus. This is over the controversy of when to celebrate Easter. And it's interesting that the East had a different tradition given to them probably by Apostle John that differed from the tradition that was given by Peter, where the East would celebrate it on the traditional Jewish date, where in the West, according to Peter, it would be celebrated on the first Sunday of Easter. And Pope St. Victor actually threatened to excommunicate the entire East over the issue. And it was Irenaeus of Lyons who stepped in and was able to calm down the Holy Father, I should say, early father who was a Holy Father, not to do so, and he relented. And after this incident, this was around the year 190 AD, Irenaeus disappears from history and is presumed to have died around the year 202 AD. It's not until Gregory of Tours wrote his History of the Franks do we find Irenaeus mentioned as a martyr. And that is our early church father for today, St. Irenaeus of Lyons. And coming up on the other side of the break, the guy who started it all, Karl Keating, is joining us. We're going to be talking about an apologetics classic, No Popery. Stay tuned, folks.
In Luke 7, Jesus said, "I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven her, because she has been shown great love." According to St. John of the Cross, Christians should always remember that the value of their good works is not based on number and excellence. Their value is based on the love for God that prompts them to do the works. May we always be motivated by true love for God, and not worry so much about what we do, but why we do it.
Did you know my mom's gonna have a baby?
She is? Will it be a boy? Or will it be a girl?
We don't know yet, but we heard the heartbeat and my dad said this is gonna be someone very special.
You mean like being a president? Or maybe a doctor?
Well, probably maybe like a singer or dancer, I think.
Hello, my name is Marianne Koharski. I'm the director of Pro-Life Across America. We know that every baby is a miracle and has the potential to do great things. If you know someone who is pregnant or in need of alternatives or assistance, or would like to support the work of Pro-Life Across America, please call 1-800-366-7773 or visit our website at prolifeacrossamerica.org. Pro-Life Across America is non-political and totally educational.
Pro-Life Across America, the Billboard people.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for your support here at Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Here's an easy way to do it. If you're going to sell or buy a house, call Real Estate for Life, 877-543-3871, because they're going to get you a Christ-centered agent to purchase your home or to sell your home. And at the close of escrow, a portion of his commission goes right back to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Call 877-543-3871. Thank you so much for your support.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody, to Hands On Apologetics. And today's guest is a person who has, I think, been one of the most influential figures in my life. I don't think I would have even known about apologetics or how to refute arguments if it wasn't for Karl Keating and his great books and work. As you know, Karl Keating is the founder of Catholic Answers, and nowadays he's a full-time author. So far, he has 16 books that he has published, included, of course, Catholicism and Fundamentalism, Debating Catholicism series, Book for Life, No Apology, and many others. He also writes in other genres as well as religion, literature, outdoors, self-publishing, and so on, including fiction. And Karl, welcome to Hands On Apologetics.
Gary, it's good to be back with you for another one of our look-sees at an interesting book for those who might be interested in engaging in apologetics on their own.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And, with the coronavirus, many of us are forced indoors. So now's a great time to kind of access these classic apologetic works, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, I'm finding myself doing more reading than I normally would do. And, I suspect that's the case for most of our listeners. So it's fine to have some books at your side that are simply entertainment books, but also it's good to take the time to buckle down a bit and maybe read something with a little more substance, something that will grow your faith and your ability to explain and defend it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I love this series that we're doing, Karl, because there are so many really well-written, well-researched works out there that have been written, maybe decades ago, maybe even a couple centuries ago, that unfortunately it's not on people's radar screens. A lot of people don't know about these classic apologetic works.
Yeah, and, some people have almost an aversion to reading a book that might have to be purchased from a used book dealer or in reprint. Or they have a bit of an aversion to reading anything that's older than they are. And that's too bad because most of the good stuff is older than we are.
Yeah.
I remember once being in Maryland and I gave a parish seminar. And at the conclusion of it, a deacon from the parish came up to me and he was rather self-satisfied, I think, when he told me that he never read any religious books published published before 1965, which was the end of the Second Vatican Council.
Yeah.
And I didn't have the wits about me at the time to ask him whether he ever read the Bible.
But you always think of those after the fact, don't you?
That's right. But the fact of the matter is, for all the good things, including, I like to think, maybe a few of my own books that have been published since 1965, actually there's a much greater number of books published before that time that are probably every bit as good or better and more useful for those who want to learn the faith.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And especially, for me, just in my reading, I noticed that there is a kind of sweet spot between the 1890s and maybe the beginning of World War II. It seems like religious dialogues and writing was very rich and very scholarly, a lot more than you would find after, say, Vatican II.
Yes, but not scholarly in a dry sense.
Yes.
Scholarly in a good argument, convincing sense. I mean, in my memoir, Book for Life, for example, I look at 25 books that were key in my own development. And most of them were written before 1965. Many of them in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And those books, almost without an exception, were written in a very winning and winsome way. They were substantive. They got to the point. They explained or defended the Catholic position, as the case may be. But reading them, I couldn't help but say to myself, how I wish I could have spent evenings around a fireside talking with that author or that author or that author.
Yeah.
And I normally don't feel that way about authors of my own generation or later. So that early part of the 20th century, I think, was in terms of writing style and substance and the pleasure one gets from reading, I think that was the high point, at least in English, of Catholic writing.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. And you're right. It's scholarly, but it's also engaging and actually kind of entertaining as well. There's a little bit of chivalry in some of the writings of that period.
There's a lot. I mean, for example, when Arnold Lunn, who was a convert to the faith, had an exchange of letters with, I think it was C.E.M. Joad, who at the time was an agnostic. Later he became a Christian in Anglican. And they had a debate in writing, by exchanging letters, on what that was called Science and the Supernatural. That's how the book came out eventually. That was in the 1930s. But in their first exchange of letters, Lunn refers back to a time when he was invited over to Joad's house to meet and to sort of lay down the rules of engagement. And I'm paraphrasing here, but Lunn said something in his first letter saying, even though we disagree on so much, I knew straight off that we would get along, because how could you not with somebody who had an appreciation for the art of Van Dyck, who's a famous, oil painter. And so you immediately get this high level of courtesy and cultivation among the disputants of the time. You don't see that so much anymore. And I think it's because even, say, in our modern time, the last few decades, even the good guys on our side, say, tend not to have that expansive background of education and cultural sensibility that was evident 80 or 90 or 100 years ago. And that makes a difference in writing. And it also makes a difference in the way one approaches an antagonist. Because some of many of the books I mentioned in Book for Life are set pieces between, a Catholic and a non-Catholic. But the courtesy level is always extraordinary. And you so rarely see that nowadays.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah, I remember a quote from one of Lunn's many autobiographies where he talks about meeting Joad at a tennis club, I believe, and he says that though we attacked each other with the utmost violence, nevertheless we're still friends and could chat and enjoy the game of tennis.
That's right. That's right. And it's precisely that kind of thing. Lunn himself, as I say, was not originally a Catholic. In, I think it was 1925 or so, he wrote a book called Roman Converts, in which he castigated gently people who had become Catholics, and among them were John Henry Newman and Ronald Knox. Well, years later, Lunn and Knox had an exchange of letters in the book called Difficulties. It's my favorite Catholic book, just about. And it was only a year or two after that Knox received Lunn into the church. And at that point, after Lunn's reception, Knox said that he had been tempted when Lunn's original book, Roman Converts, came out, to send a real snorter of a letter, as he put it, to Lunn, who he thought was somewhat unfair in criticizing Knox becoming a Catholic. But Knox said, I held off sending it. And it turned out to be one of the few instances where doing the right thing actually had a good result.
That's funny.
But it's that kind of high level camaraderie, even between opponents, that was common and an everyday occurrence back then, that unfortunately we don't see much at all now. And I don't have in mind some of the people we'll be discussing later in this hour about some of the way off at the edge fundamentals and so on. I mean, even within the church or close to the church, often when we're having disagreements, they're simply not at the level because the disputants are not at the level of the ones that were maybe three generations ago.
Right. Yeah, that's true. But, that's an important lesson, though, that building that friendship and camaraderie, even though we disagree on it, bears good fruit. For example, Lund became Catholic. C.M. Joad, I believe, became Catholic or Anglican.
No, he became Anglican, High Church Anglican, yeah. But he's been an agnostic,
Right.
And he even wrote a book about his conversion. Yeah, and that would not have happened, either of those conversions, had the Catholic fellow in those exchanges been less civil than he was, or uncivil at times, which sometimes you find. I was just reading today online, I won't mention names here, but there was a prominent American Catholic, who was writing against a former Catholic who had left and joined another church. And the dispute was a bit contentious. And I think the men had once been actually friends and had fallen away from one another at some point. But I didn't see really on either side the kind of high-level courtesy and cooperation that one would expect, or one commonly saw from comparable antagonisms way back when.
Yeah.
Now, partly this might have been because, most of the books, for example, that I mentioned in Book for Life that fall in this category were written by Englishmen. And English Catholics of the earlier 20th century maybe were somewhat different from the American Catholics of the same time. Maybe the Americans were more rough and tumble and, sort of Wild West kind of folks, where the Englishmen were more traditional, gentleman's club of London, having a cigar around, in the Commons room or at night or something, that kind of thing, where the upbringing of the two sides is somewhat different. So you get a tonal approach that's maybe was somewhat different even back then. But I have to say, I miss having not lived in that era when that could have been around people like that. There really aren't too many cases. There have been some cases, not too many cases in my own time where I could say, gosh, I really wish I could have spent countless evenings over at that guy's house just talking, where I easily could imagine myself having said that 75 or 90 years ago.
Yeah, I totally agree. We're chatting with Karl Keating, and actually we haven't talked about the book yet, but we're going to talk about Herbert Thurstons' book, No Popery. More to come on the other side of the break. You listen to Hands on Apologetics. We'll be right back.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And here's an easy way to support us by going to smile.amazon.com and type in Catholic Resource Center or Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And when you log in your Amazon account and you purchase products, a portion of it will go right back in supporting Virgin Most Powerful Radio. And it doesn't cost you a dime. I want to thank you ahead of time because that supports us year-round. May God bless you and your family.
Hi, this is Jesse Romero from the Terry and Jesse Show, also from Jesus 911. Let's face it, we all need to use the internet, but we need screen accountability. Why? Pornography is a huge problem, especially on the internet. And every time we tap into the internet, we get bombarded with images and temptations that degrade our humanity. So we need Covenant Eyes to block these pornographic sites and advertisements from infiltrating our lives. Covenant Eyes helps us take custody of our eyes and custody of our intellect. So I recommend you go to covenanteyes.com and type in the promo code VMPR to support the network. Protect yourself and your family from the imminent threats on the internet. www.covenanteyes.com, code VMPR. NPR. Live porn free. Thank you for listening to Virgin's Most Powerful Radio. Thank you. God bless you. Keep the faith.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. We are chatting with Karl Keating, a classic apologetic work, which is by Father Herbert Thurston, called No Popery. And Karl, who was Father Thurston?
Herbert Thurston was an English Jesuit. He was born in 1856 and died in 1939. He had a long life. He was, so far as I have ever come across, probably the most effective Jesuit, at least, writer in defense of the faith in the, say, first third or so of the 20th century. He had a wonderful ability to see through other scholars' arguments and to identify errors that they had, large and small. There was one time when he was being challenged by G.G. Colton, who was a Cambridge professor, an Anglican, and an anti-Catholic. And they were disputing over the writings of an American named H.C. Lee, L-E-A, who had written a book about the Inquisition. And Lee considered himself sort of the American version of Colton, and Colton was rather proud of that fact and thought Lee's books were very good. And Thurston said, actually, they have lots of problems, many errors in them. So Thurston was challenged by Colton to come up with examples of mistakes, because Thurston said, I could find one blatant error on every page of his book. You know, if that's true, then that's a real indictment against a scholarly book.
Right.
And Colton said, okay. So Thurston said, choose any 10 pages from this book by Lee. And Colton said, I'll be generous. Here are 12 pages. Find me 10 mistakes. And Thurston came back and showed him 15 mistakes. And Colton had to acknowledge that that Lee was not the scholar that he thought he was. Okay, but when I read in detail, or read Thurston's detail about all these mistakes and all, and I was amazed at how precise he was and how widely educated and well read he was in the particular subject area, because he was able to see an error where even most scholars and certainly editorial people who'd be dealing with the book would not even suspect that there was a problem. So Thurston has always struck me as a very fine example of the best of Jesuit scholarship and the best of English Catholic scholarship. So he wrote this book called No Popery, with an exclamation point at the end, chapters on anti-papal prejudice. He wrote this in 1930. It's got 16 chapters looking at different claims against the church. And the first one is simply called Bad Popes. And he goes in to explain, yes, there have been bad popes historically, and goes through some of them. But then he goes on, and he for example, he's got a chapter called The Campaign Against Pius IX, who was the second longest reigning pope ever. And one of the particular charges that Thurston looks at was the complaint that Pius IX, who was considered a very conservative man in terms of personality, at least for most of his reign, at least the latter part of his reign, was what had a dalliance with some women in the Vatican. And Thurstons blows this out of the water. And then there's another claim that Pius IX was funneling Vatican money to women. And it turns out that in his will, the Pope, whose personal possessions were almost nothing, because he doesn't own the Vatican. He can't dispose of those items in his will, but he had a few personal items. He gave those to his two widowed sisters, and that was the origin of anti-Catholic prejudice, at least of this sort, against Pius IX. The charge that he was funneling money out of the Vatican to pay for dalliance with women, But the whole thing was maybe the equivalent of a few $100s or whatever it was at the time, to his two widowed sisters, who were very elderly, of course, at that time. So those are the kinds of things, some of those that Herbert Thurston looks at in the book No Popery.
Yeah. In a way, the lowbrow fundamentalist no popery history kind of brings out the best in Catholic scholarship, doesn't it? Because otherwise, details like that probably would have just been passed over, and it served as a kind of grain of sand that Thurston could produce a pearl of history from. Yes,
I mean, when I got first involved in apologetics about 40 years ago, a lot of this was still prevalent among Protestants, not just fundamentalist Protestants, but also many evangelicals. Many of these folks had been brought up with prejudices either within their families or they had imbibed prejudices from the pulpit at their churches. And I even had, a number of debates against people of this sort, and you'll find those in my book, Debating Catholicism. So I'd say for maybe the first half of my 40 years as an apologist, that was a large focus of the work I did, because that kind of thing was still out there a lot. It's not so much now, because of course there's been a generational change, and you don't find quite the ferocity against the church in those quarters as you once did. You find it some, but not as intense, or not, at least it's not as widespread. Even if it may be as intense, but you don't find so many instances of it. But so even then, say around 1990, I was finding things that Thurston was writing about in 1930, so 60 years earlier. Right. These prejudices and these misunderstandings are almost perennial.
Yeah, I agree. Why do you think that's so? You would think that someone the caliber of Thurston and many other people too who have debunked a lot of the no popery stuff. What was it that made it live on despite being eviscerated by these scholars?
Well, I think we have to look back at history, in that the Protestant Reformation had three main branches: Lutheranism in Germany, Calvinism in Switzerland and elsewhere, and then the Anglican Reformation in England. And of the three, the one that became most viscerally anti-Catholic was actually the Anglican, even though, in terms of theology and practice and liturgy, the Anglican Church, way back when, was much closer to the Catholic Church than either Lutheranism or especially Calvinism. But what happened is that within England, you had a strong anti-Catholic prejudice, and much of this was based on politics, because when Henry VIII began unwittingly his new church, one of the things that happened was that the monasteries and other religious institutions were confiscated, and the proceeds were given out to high-ranking nobles and the like. So there developed a big financial interest in tearing the Catholic Church apart. And you didn't find the same parallel with the Lutherans or the Calvinists. Okay, yeah. So you got early on in England, even in the 16th century, a strong prejudice in favor of being prejudiced against the Catholic Church. And unscrupulous Anglican church leaders who certainly knew better would put fire out there and would stoke the fires against Catholicism, because the ultimate result of that was the elimination of the Catholic Church as a propertied or financial institution, and those monies will go to, friends and family. Right. So I think a lot of that historical background accounts for the persistence of this kind of no popery attitude so strongly in English-speaking countries, including the U.S.
Yeah, that's interesting, because it's almost like the Energizer Bunny. It just keeps going and going, despite being refuted time and time again. And, no one's done as much work at refuting this stuff as you have, so you could attest to its tenacity.
I can't, one of my books that has, like, Thurstons' book has 16 chapters. I have a book that also has 16 chapters looking at what I call episodes in anti-Catholicism. And that book is called Jeremiah's Lament. The Jeremiah is not the biblical Jeremiah. I just borrowed the sense of lamentation from the biblical book. But there's a Jeremiah Crowley whom I write about in this book in the last chapter. And he was a former Catholic priest in Chicago who came out against the Catholic Church in the early part of the 20th century. But so I have, my own book, which is sort of like the no popery book, and of course, since mine is still in print and Thurstons is not, and my book is not as good as his, but it does show maybe some more modern examples of this going into our own era. And yes, this kind of prejudice still persists out there. But I always give the folks who push this stuff a bit of leeway, because I think almost universally they're not pushing this anti-papal or anti-Catholic position so much out of spite or bad faith. This is something that they were taught, and they think these charges are true. Yeah. Now, there are fewer, I think, of these people now than there were 40 years ago, but there are still several million of them just in the U.S., and it's an interesting thing that when you have widespread confusion or misunderstanding about something, whether religious or otherwise, it takes generations to overcome, no matter how efficient or how well-written something like Thurstons' book might have been. Because, of course, his book, even in its own time, would have been read by very few of the people who were doing these things.
That's true. That's a very good point. We're chatting with Karl Keating about Herbert Thurstons' book, No Popery. More to come on the other side of the break. You're listening to Hands on Apologetics.
Welcome, Daniel. You're on the line. What's on your mind, brother?
Hi, I just wanted to share a testimony about Virgin Most Powerful Radio. I had a buddy at work who, he's a lukewarm Catholic guy, and I wanted him to start listening to the Terry and Jesse show, so I kept telling him to download the app, and he kept putting me off. So one day, I grabbed his phone and I downloaded the app for him. I went on vacation, and I kept telling him to listen to it. He would kind of put me off. I came back from vacation. He comes to my cubicle, and he says to me, "Hey, man, I've been listening to Terry and Jesse's show, and it's great." And it's made a big impact in his life. The guy, he's going to weekly adoration a couple times a week. He goes to the Mass in the morning. Mm-hmm. He's an on-fire Catholic, and he promotes the Terry and Jesse show in the Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
Daniel, what a testimony, and I want to encourage our listeners to get those cards by going to virginmostpowerfulradio.org and do what Daniel's doing. Go out and spread the faith by inviting people to listen to Virgin Most Powerful. Daniel, thanks for your testimony, brother. God love you.
You're welcome.
Genesis 1:27 says, God created man in his own image. Male and female he created them. According to Pope St. John the 23rd, it is not true that some human beings are by nature superior and others inferior. All human beings are equal in their natural dignity. May God help us to look upon everyone as a person created in His image and likeness, and treat everyone the same without favoritism or prejudice.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Karl Keating about Herbert Thurstons' book, No Popery. And actually, before we jump more into Thurstons' book, Karl, you made a really good point before the break that many of these classic works, their effectiveness was limited because the people who really needed to read them wouldn't read them. But I think now with the internet and social media, that barrier is kind of disintegrating, isn't it?
I think so, because so many refutations of these kinds of things are available quite freely on the internet. Or if you want a book version of it, if you're willing to look at something that disagrees with your particular prejudice, you could get, say, a digital version for $2 or $3. Where back in Thurston's time, if you were open enough to listening to his refutation, you had to buy his book, which of course was a hardback back then. And yes, it was cheap compared to hardbacks today, but still there was more of an effort you'd have to make. And you couldn't do it stealthily. Somebody would see the book on your nightstand or whatever. You're reading a Catholic book, where nowadays, if you're non-Catholic, you can actually investigate the Catholic claim or defense without anybody knowing it. So there's a kind of safety in it now that there wasn't back, in the 1930s.
Yeah, that's true. In fact, even back in the, it would be the early 90s, I knew non-Catholics who were reading Catholic books, and they would carry it around in a brown paper bag and exchange Catholic books because they didn't want their fellow congregants to see them, holding popery
I don't know if you remember if it happened when you were in grade school, but we used to have to cover our school books with butcher paper. And if you do that, then nobody knows what book you're reading. So you could be reading contraband like a Catholic book, and still go to your fundamentalist church on Sunday, and nobody would know. See,
there you go. Yeah, that's the advantage of having a hardback. But let's talk about the No Popery book. So he tackles, these culminations against Pope Pius IX.
Yep.
What else does he cover?
Let me share one with you that this is sort of my favorite one of all the charges because I actually heard this.
Okay.
And it's the claim that in the 13th century, a pope ordered that heretics be exterminated. And this is what Thurston writes, and it's about Pope Innocent writing a letter to the King of Aragon in 1213. And this is the time when the Albigensian heresy was all over Western Europe. Okay, so it was a big problem. And Thurston says, the Pope explains that those heretics of Toulouse in France, who honestly and in good faith wish to return to the Church, may be reconciled by their bishop. But, the Pope goes on to say, we order that those whom he, the bishop, brands as infected by heretical depravity and who persist in their errors are to be exterminated from the city, and that their property is to be confiscated, and that they are never more to be admitted into the town unless afterwards, touched by grace, they give proof of their deeds that they are true adherents of the Orthodox belief. Well, even somebody like Dr. Colton, whom I mentioned earlier in the show, the Cambridge professor is anti-Catholic, glommed onto this because the Pope is saying heretics are to be exterminated. But the word exterminated in Latin, exterminare, has multiple meanings. And the meaning used by the Pope very clearly was not exterminate by death, to kill, but exterminate means to send into the external, that is, into the outside, that is, to excommunicate. So the Pope is telling the King of Aragon, if you've got these heretics who are persisting and they're causing problems and they won't reform, expel them from the town, send them away until such time that they repent and come back to the true faith. And Thurston pointed out to Colton, who only had the first half of the quotation up to the word, they're to be exterminated, said, look at what the Pope says. He says, after the property is to be confiscated and so on, they are never more to be admitted into the town unless afterwards, touched by grace, they give proof of their deeds and of their faith. Well, if you're exterminated by death, you're not going to repent later and come back and prove that you repented, are you? So the sense of exterminari, meaning exterminated as killed, was not possibly the one that the Pope was using. But here we had a brilliant man, Colton, who was prejudicial against the Catholic faith. And because of that, he didn't do his homework. As soon as he got to the juicy part of the quotation from this letter to the King of Aragon, where he got the word exterminated, he stopped reading. See? And he said, well, gosh, the Pope is saying kill all these people because they disagree with us. And that's not at all what the Pope is saying. So that's the kind of thing that Thurston deals with throughout his book.
Yeah, in fact, they came in handy because I remember we had a debate we set up between you and Dave Hunt here in Detroit, and that was one of the home runs he hit during the debate, I think, was he brought up the exterminare thing, and you just knocked it out of the park, thanks to Herbert Thurston, I guess.
Because of Herbert Thurston, yes. Because had it not been for Thurston, I wouldn't have been aware of that, and I wouldn't have known how to handle it. It was one of those things where you're sort of hoping your debate opponent will bring up something that you just learned how to refute a few days before, you know. And Dave Hunt, oh God rest his soul, he did just that, and it was a setup for me, you know. So yeah, I remember that, and it wasn't the only time I was able to use that, but that was in front of a big audience of mainly non-Catholics. So I hope that particular example was one that, you know, would have settled in some minds saying, oh, okay, so this anti-Catholic Dave Hunt got the meaning of these words entirely wrong, and so his argument makes no sense.
Right. Yeah, he did the same thing Colton did. He stopped right after extermination.
Well, he found what he wanted. See, this is the problem with prejudice. When you're prejudiced against a particular position or thing or organization, and you're looking for a good argument or just simply dirt on it, you stop looking once you think you found what you need. And that's the mistake of a lot of anti-Catholics. They'll go just so far and say, okay, that's something I can use against the Catholic Church. And they don't look any further, even along the same line of inquiry. But had they done so, they very likely would have found something to show them that they quite misunderstood what was going on. And it can happen to bright people like Thurston too, or not so bright people like Dave Hunt. That's a failing that is almost universal when people are prejudiced and are sort of out to get another person or an organization or religion.
Yeah, and it also highlights the importance of sticking to primary sources. Don't just assume that because somebody quotes something that they're giving you the correct quote in context.
Precisely, and that's the kind of thing I bring out in my book, Jeremiah's Lament. So many times you've got an anti-Catholic passing along something from another anti-Catholic, one who might be, like, say, the late Lorraine Bettner, who might have been considered a true scholar and he would get everything right. And yet, when he fumbles, you pass along his fumble, and you're just continuing to fumble. And there's a natural tendency among people who are out to get the other side, that once they find something useful, that's as far as they look. They don't go back to the sources.
Yeah, very good, very good. So that definitely is a gem there in Thurston's book. What else does he cover in the book?
Well, I've got another quotation here I'd like to read from. It's at the end of the book.
Okay.
And it's the first paragraph in a chapter called "What Prejudice Ignores," and I think it's a good way for all of us to think about how to think about these things. And this is what Thurston says. Argument must always be, to some extent, a personal matter. What convinces me will not necessarily convince my next-door neighbor. It may be that he sees difficulties that I do not see. His experience has been different from my own. Things appeal to him that do not appeal to me. And on the other hand, he may not feel the need of certain demonstrations which appear to me to be vital if the basis of the argument is to be firm and its conclusions logical. My own line of study has brought me into contact with much of the seamy side of medieval Christianity. Often I found myself hesitating for a moment and asking myself, if these charges are true, if these abuses were tolerated, was the church, after all, a purifying and spiritualizing influence in the life of the people? But by giving myself time and weighing the matter fairly, I have felt able to affirm with conviction that even at the worst of periods, the clergy and their teaching as a whole made for good. And I think this is almost a beautiful approach to disputes, and to actually it shows the way a true scholar and also a gentleman like Thurston approaches something when he finds an argument against the church that seems like a body blow. At first, he's thrown off. It throws him for a loop. But then he goes and he researches it. He reads up about it. He studies the issue. And even though he'll end up perhaps finding that, yes, there were churchmen who did some wrong things or handled the matter misappropriately, still the larger substance of the charge is diffused or even eliminated. And the worst you can throw against the church, go ahead and do it. But if it's all taken into account and you do your homework, you'll find the church still stands. Now, the cross is still there, and the church is still under it. And that's the way it's going to be. We can take solace in knowing that no matter how bad things are, and, we're at a fairly low point in the church right now, given a couple things, that's not going to undo the church. It doesn't undo the church's claims. But like Thurston, even if we feel a momentary body blow and some charges made, or something occurs and appears in the newspaper headlines, we can take solace in knowing that if we do the homework, things can be put in perspective, and we'll see that Christ is still with his church.
Yeah, very, very good. Very well said. Karl, where can people go to get a hold of all your great writings?
Well, the easiest place is Amazon. Just search on my name, and you'll see a list of all my books. One of my more popular ones recently has been Debating Catholicism. And I mentioned in this show already Jeremiah's Lament, which is quite appropriate to the topic for today. And then, I've got other books there too. So go to Amazon, and that's where you'll find them.
Great. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Gary.
All right. Karl Keating, ladies and gentlemen. And, check out his books. Karl's done such a fantastic job of research and writing. And it's just fun to read, too. So check out not only his apologetic stuff, but his other stuff as well. By the way, I'm going to be on Catholic Answers Live tonight. The topic will be, is sacred tradition necessary? So if you just can't get enough apologetics, you might want to check that out. Also, coming up next, we have High Impact Catholic Talk, and then the Terry and Jesse Show. So stay tuned, everybody.
In the 1990s, I lived and worked in Hollywood. But when my wife Betty's mom took ill, we relocated to Orange County. And it was during this time in our lives that I converted to Catholicism. Once my eyes were opened to the truth, I couldn't learn enough about the faith. But I had less free time than ever, especially with a long commute. That's when I discovered the real value of Catholic audio. Listening to cassette tapes transformed my daily commute into a miniature retreat. And that's the beauty of Virgin Most Powerful Radio today. Since the podcasts are archived, you can listen anytime on our smartphone app. I know how listening to Catholic audio can bring you closer to Christ and His Church. So I encourage you to visit the App Store or go to vmpr.org and download the app today. It just might change your life. I'm Matthew Arnold for Virgin Most Powerful Radio.